My small Showman'S engine needs some repairs. Part 7. Repainting the flywheel was a more difficult job than I anticipated. The first attempt was a fail with a capital F. I removed all of the primer and paint, then started again. But the job was problematic to the end, as I was using an old rattle can of spray paint, and I also blame the weather. It's not a good idea to use a tin of spray paint that's been sat on the shelf for nearly 4 years. I followed the manufacturer's instructions and shook the can for at least 5 minutes, but it was spitting out small particles. Also, when I painted this flywheel, I was by a wide open door in the outer part of the workshop and it was a windy day, so I think some particles were picked up that way. This paint job is no good at all. The only thing to do is to start again. I put it in the food container and then I poured some cellulose thinners over the top of it. What I've missed out in this episode is I rubbed down the paint that was full of particles and then I repainted it, but the paint reacted with the paint underneath and made things worse. Here's the flywheel sat in the food container. Why is it in a food container? Because once the lid is on, the smell is contained within the container, which means that if I can't smell it, I won't be breathing in the fumes. I've just about run out of cellulose thinners. I need to buy some more. You can only use this stuff so many times for paint removal before it gets very contaminated. I just had enough cellulose thinners to more or less cover the flywheel, so I decided to turn it upside down. The rear of the flywheel is like a shallow dish. After an overnight stay in the cellulose thinners, this is once again what the flywheel looks like. You can see the colour of the thinners is different though, because not only has it dissolved the Crimson Lake paint, it's dissolved the grey primer underneath. Now for a bit of déjà vu. I've seen this before somewhere, and that was after I removed the original damaged paint from the flywheel. After painting the flywheel with etching primer, once it was thoroughly dry, I put the flywheel back into the lathe. This seemed to be quite a good way of rubbing down the primer and keying the paint. You will notice that I used masking tape around the edge before I painted it with etching primer, just like I showed in a previous episode on Paint Job Mistake Part 1. I removed the flywheel from the lathe chuck and took it into the outer part of the workshop. I'm painting the inside of the flywheel first, and hopefully this should give me some indication of whether or not the paint is serviceable. These aerosol cans do have a shelf life. Two good things today. The paint from the can doesn't seem to be splattering it with particles, and it's not windy outside, so there isn't half of the garden blowing in through the door. Because this video isn't running in real time, it looks like I'm constantly applying layer after layer of paint, and I am, but not quite as quickly as this. And between coats, I do allow the paint some time to dry because I don't want any drips, and I don't want the paint to be so thick that it takes months to go hard. I allowed a good amount of time for the paint to dry, and a few days later it's time to work on the flywheel. What I'm doing at the moment is rubbing down the surface of the paint using some 600 grade wet-to-dry sandpaper, and as you can see I'm using it very wet. This allows this silicone carbide paper to cut much better and avoids clogging and rubbing, the last thing that you want. When doing jobs like this though, you have to be very careful. If you rub too hard, you will rub through the paint and you'll see some primer. Then you will have to apply another coat of paint, and as it's been several days since I applied this coat, I would think that it would react with the new coat. I don't want to give it another coat of paint. Instead, I'm going to apply a top coat of this stuff. It's Ronseal Hard Glaze Clear Polyurethane Varnish. Some viewers may be thinking, well, the finish on the flywheel isn't too bad. Why don't I just polish this surface up? The problem is, I don't have a suitable small polisher, and I don't want to get a finish on this flywheel like a car body. This is the reason for doing what you see me doing at the moment. I'm using a cotton cloth to apply some varnish to the surface of the paint. This first varnish is straight from the tin and it's far too thick. But it's a good starting point. The polyurethane varnish soaks into the cloth. What I need to do is make the whole thing a lot thinner by adding some white spirit. Once I've thinned the varnish, it's a case of wipe on, wipe off. If this flywheel ends up looking like a car body, the rest of the traction engine is going to look terrible, because the rest of the paintwork on the traction engine has stood the test of time, but it's damaged in places. So what I'm actually doing here is just degrading the gloss of the paintwork. The clear varnish is gloss, but it's not the same as a finish straight from a spray can. I applied a couple more coats of this varnish, and each time I thinned down the mixture using the white spirit. I know it doesn't look too stunning in this clip, but once the varnish has dried, it will settle and flatten out. That's the plan anyway. Here you can see it's starting to look much better, and you could be forgiven for thinking that there were brush marks in this paint. It's much more difficult applying varnish with a cloth when the part isn't flat. It's time now to remove the masking tape and sit back and look at the job, which, to be honest, I think is not bad at all. It should fit in with the rest of the paintwork of the traction engine. I'll find out in the next episode, but that's it for now. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful. Please take the time to visit my Mainsteam Models website and click on the section of the website that says Video Playlists. And by doing that, you can find other videos that you may like to watch. And by using the playlists, you can actually watch the videos back to back.